ERG. Oh, thank you, Monica. Monica's going to be helping to let people in and with the recording today. So, as I said, it's about creating real impact without formal authority. And this is something that I've seen with many inclusion champions that I've worked with and ERG leads. And also what I experienced quite early on in my inclusion journey, working for organizations, and that, you have a mission, you know what you want to do, but you struggle. And this is really, I guess, one of the ways that I was able to make a significant impact on the culture in the organizations that I was in and that I work with. And so I'm really delighted to share this with you because I know it's a challenge that many people face. So thank you all for joining. If you can keep your cameras off and yourself on mute, there will be a Q&A. I want it to be a very informal session today because it is really about helping you to overcome the challenges that you have in terms of influencing the culture within your organization. So if you have any questions, do please raise your hand or put a comment into the chat. I'd love to be able to help everyone. This is going to be an interactive session though, so there is going to be some activity. If you don't have any questions, we've got a poll and some other bits and pieces that I think will be helpful in helping you to really fully understand how this works in terms of influencing the people that need to be influenced in your organization. So thank you everyone for joining again. My name is Atlyn. I'm the CEO of Communicate Inclusively, and we're an inclusion consultancy. And we're just about to launch our new e-learning program called the Inclusive Impact Lab. And this is one of the main modules within that e-learning program. And so I guess I'm giving you a bit of a sneak peek into that module and what it's about. But as I said, it's something that I come across a lot. And so I thought it'd be a great way to really showcase the e-learning program and what it can deliver. And so in today's session, it's designed for, I guess, people like you who are inclusion champions, ERG leads, who really, want to understand how to influence their organizations, to really understand why inclusion work becomes very activity focused rather than impact driven, how influence actually works inside organizations, and how ERGs and culture leads like you can exert real influence. And I guess the last thing, which is also really important, is another chapter in the e-learning program, is how to create change that is sustainable rather than exhausting. Because when you are trying to influence change and you're not quite making the progress that you want, it can become very exhausting, and it makes it hard then to sustain the work that you're doing. But as I said, this is a very practical session. And I want this to be really grounded in strategic and strategy in terms of how you build that influence. So if you do want to find out more about the e-learning program at any time, I've got a few QR codes throughout this session. So let's get started. As I said before, this is really around understanding how you can have an impact on your organization in terms of influence and how you can create change that is credible, sustainable, and doesn't rely entirely on you and the energy that you have, all right? And so it'd be great just to get a pulse, I guess, right now in terms of who is in the room with us today. It's just helpful for me to know, because I do think within organizations, the role of culture change agent, inclusion champion, as we call them in the e-learning program, sits with a number of different people. You can do the QR code there, or you can go on to menti.com and type in that number 21625832. They can come in many guises. And sometimes, you don't actually sit within the realm of HR. Quite often you could be in a very different department like I was. I was in marketing and in insights. And I took on the role of being the inclusion lead within my organization. And that's really how I identified that it was something that I was really passionate about, something that I was committed to, and really wanted to see that change being made. Thank you for everyone. So you can see here, individual contributors supporting inclusion work. We come in all guises, but for all of us, we're really keen on wanting to make an impact and a change in our organizations. And it's a really important role to play. But again, I think we cannot rely just on our passion and our commitment. We really need to be thinking about, what strategic role we can take within our organizations to make a real change. So let's start thinking about this then, and what happens really with our good intentions, which is what a lot of this work is based on. Let's think about, all the activities that we're doing, because that's sometimes what happens. We just get focused on activities, whether that is, awareness days, whether that's events, panel discussions, listening sessions, and they're all, really important work. Well, thank you. I've been spotlighted now. Thank you. I can see myself, which is great. Um, they're all really important activities that we do. But this is sometimes where we can start to feel a little bit burnt out because we're doing so much good work, but it's not leading to impact. And that is what we want to implement. We're not here, as the entertainment committee. We're here, we're doing this work because we want to make an impact on the culture. We want to create a place where everyone can thrive. We want to ensure there is a sense of belonging for everybody. These are some of the, the missions that we have, and that what keeps us, I guess, pushing and keeps us motivated. But quite often, that mission, that drive for inclusion, a space where everyone has that sense of belonging, can mean that we focus a lot on these activities. And when they do lead to impact, it's great. But when they don't, when you're not seeing them create the change you want, it can be quite demoralizing sometimes, to be honest with you. And this is when it's not just necessarily a physical burnout, it's a burnout because all this work I'm doing, it's not delivering the results. I'm still having colleagues come up to me and say that they've been treated in this way. I'm still seeing, that the recruitment processes are not necessarily bringing in diverse people into my organization. I'm still seeing the same people getting promoted and getting opportunities. And so, how can we use the work, use our time and energy to actually create that impact, to create system change, to influence decisions? This is what we really want to do. And this is sometimes the barriers that we face, okay? So what you might find is that, your ideas are being supported in principle, but maybe they're not prioritized. And so it's almost a bit like lip service. You're sharing your ideas with senior leaders, maybe, and with managers, maybe even your exco and your SLT. And they're kind of nodding and saying, yes, it's a great idea, but it's not prioritized because there are many other things that they're prioritizing above the inclusion work. Maybe, your leaders are expressing support, great work. I love what you're doing. Thank you so much. At side of desk, I can see you're doing above and beyond your role. But then in practice, very little changes structurally. So, what does that support really mean? Maybe the initiatives that you're doing are relying very heavily on volunteers. And it's not necessarily those senior leaders that are taking part. Quite often the inclusion work can sit with people lower down the hierarchy, which means again that you're struggling to actually create an impact and to create a change. And maybe what happens often is that there is this initial energy and excitement and everyone's really keen to support, but then over time the momentum slows, especially now that we're seeing that D&I and inclusion work is not as on trend as it used to be, but it's still very much needed. It's still, required in terms of everyone in the business feeling that sense of well-being, that they're happy to be here, that they can be productive, that they want to, be there. You can retain your staff. So the need for it is still very much there. But when you start on this high with lots of energy and you're not seeing the impact and the volunteers start to slowly fade away, the momentum can also fade, and it sits then with those champions like yourselves. And so there's sometimes this gap between activity and impact, okay? And it's not linked to commitment. It's really not. Our passion and our commitment to this purpose is still there, but it's really around influence. And that's what we're going to talk about today, influence, because organizations change through decisions, through priorities and behaviors, and influencing those things is not always straightforward, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about. And do remember, if you have any questions, any thoughts even, anything that you've experienced, I would love to hear it. So do please put it in the chat so that we can all see your thoughts as we go along as well. So let's talk about this influence then. How do we create it? And why is it so important? So the first thing, I guess, is that influence is actually the important thing in terms of creating change. It's not necessarily about activity, because influence in an organization is really where things can happen and change. But it's not about your position. It's really about your relationships. It's relational, it's not positional. And just to explain that, this means that, you could perhaps be a senior leader. You may perhaps are a senior manager in your organization, but if you haven't got the relational part of that influence together, it means that you're on your own quite often sometimes. It means that others are not with you. It means that you haven't got the power to shift things within your organization. What the influence gives you is credibility. So although you may be very credible in your own role, whatever it may be, because this could be side of desk for you, the inclusion work, by having that relational and the influence piece, you become more credible in terms of your work around inclusion. It's really shaped around your relationships. So who in the organization do you have really good relationships with? It could also be regarding timing. And that timing can be linked to so many different things. It could be with regards to the timing of those key influencers. Maybe there's a time where your CEO or someone else who's a big influencer in your organization has something going on in their life. Maybe their background gives them a clearer understanding of why inclusion is important. And so they're more keen and open to listening. Or maybe what I've found is that something's happening in their view on inclusion, and it becomes more important. So, for example, maybe your CEO or senior leader's wife or partner is going through the menopause. Maybe they experience one of their, young adults in the family struggling to find a role. Maybe someone is having mental health challenges within their family or close relative. And so this again could be linked to the timing as to why for now for them, they're ready to step forward and help you to create that influence. Influence also gives you trust, and trust is so important in this, in terms of people that believe in you and can see that you genuinely believe in this. Authenticity is so key. And this is another reason why some people who get very excited about inclusion in the beginning, because they think it may be good for their social standing in the business, sometimes that momentum may fade, because maybe this mission isn't generally authentic for them, and that shines through over time. And I think the trust piece is really key, because people will then listen to you, people will really value your opinion, people will want to take part in the activities that you're doing, and when you make suggestions and ideas, people will really take it on board. It will have the weight because they trust you, and you've also got that credibility piece. The other important thing to really consider is around aligning it with the business priorities. And we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail shortly, because I think this is another really important way in which you can influence your organizations. If anyone's got any other thoughts around the influence piece and how you've been able to do that, please do share it in the chat, okay? Because this is what the session today is all about. I've kind of got 3 key things that I want to focus on, but if you have others, it would be great to hear them as well, because we're all learning as we go. I think the other important thing linked to the things I just mentioned is that you cannot carry this work alone. In fact, if you try to carry it alone within your organization, you're likely to fail. It requires people to come together, stakeholders at every level within your organization, perhaps even people outside of your organization as well, to support you in this work. And so this is why the influence is important, because how are you going to, I guess, kind of create that community? How are you going to galvanize people to want to get behind this work unless you have that credibility, the trust, and all the things I mentioned in the previous slide? So you cannot carry this alone. But what you need to think about, I guess, is not how do I convince people, but how can I influence? Where does the influence sit in this organization? That's what we need to be focusing on, okay? Because trying to convince people can work sometimes, I guess, but I think you'd have to really think about every individual person, and convincing almost feels like you're forcing them. And with influence, I feel people naturally will gravitate to your cause, will naturally gravitate towards you. Any resistance or barriers that they may have had will fall away when you are influencing them, and they want to be part of this. And this is really what we want to think about, okay? We want to think about why and how we can get people in our organizations to support our work and want to be part of this, okay? So how does influence actually work within the organizations? So I've got three things, as I said, I really want you to think about today, okay? And the first one is the everyday influence. This is how you, on a day-to-day basis, can have a real impact on the people in your organization to become that trusted voice, which is so important. And the way in which you do that is for your day-to-day actions, okay? You are role modeling what inclusion looks like, and people can see that it's a genuine thing, it's authentic, it's part of who you are. No matter what situation you're in, this inclusive practice always comes to the fore. So that could look like in a meeting, if there is someone who hasn't spoken, you will speak up and say, oh, do you have something to say? Do you have something to add? You're actively inviting voices that are maybe quieter. People see that and be like, oh, I've noticed that, she's done that. And people will respect you and see you as very credible. Maybe it's around, giving people credit for the work that they've done. Inclusion work requires a lot of activity, and maybe what you're going to do in your role as an inclusion champion is to highlight someone else who's done great. Maybe you're the one that's using inclusive language or encouraging others to use inclusive language, and someone maybe says something that maybe could be offensive. You're able to, educate them politely on maybe some other terms that they could use, and you champion it yourself, and people can role model the language that you're using. Maybe you're giving people opportunities. So maybe there's a presentation to deliver, and you're inviting other people, and maybe people who wouldn't normally get to speak are invited in by you. These are just a few things that you can do to build your credibility and in your everyday interactions to show that inclusion is part of who you are. It's around consistency, though, because it's the consistency. You can't, put a mask on today, you're putting your inclusive hat on, tomorrow you're not. People will see through that. So the consistency is where that trust is built, okay? And people will start to associate you with fairness. And that's what we want. If we're inclusion champions, we want to be seen as fair, that we want everyone to thrive in this organization. And so we're role modeling that. We want to be seen as fair. We want to be seen as thought leaders. And I think this is really important because for me, when I was bringing inclusion to the organizations that I've worked within, it was really important for me to showcase different aspects of inclusion. And so we didn't just look at one area. We tried to focus on the areas that were relevant to the people in the organization. It wasn't just about me and my identity. It was about everybody else in the business and people feeling like, oh, I can relate to that. Oh, I'm so pleased that you brought up this topic. Because it's been impacting me or it's been impacting my family members. You want to be a thought leader and bring in new ideas, innovation. And maybe that could be in the way that you're presenting the ideas. Maybe it is with regards to, we had something where we did allyship bingo. Allyship was a key thing in the business, but just talking about it didn't seem to be embedding it. So we did this activity called allyship bingo, where people had to go around and when they saw allyship in action, they'd cross it off on a bit of paper. That's just a piece of a different idea, different approach. And when you bring things like that, people will see you as a thought leader. So that's another thing. And if you do it consistently, that's what they will associate you with. And this also builds the credibility, as I mentioned before. You want people to be more open to your ideas. And so by role modeling it every day, in your actions and in your behaviors, that is the first thing and the most important one, I would say, that people will gravitate towards you when they see that you are living and breathing inclusion. I can see we've got a few comments in here. Yeah, I believe that also requires allyship too. Yes, it's very important. I find that a lot of senior leaders want the accreditation, and we'll do the tick box exercises. Yeah, exactly. A lot of organizations want to have the accreditations, they want to have the badges, the titles, etc. We're going to come on to that next. So thank you, Charlotte and Sandra, for sharing that. I do think both of those things are very true. So let's move on. And this is where this is going to come in, actually. We're going to talk a bit about how you can connect inclusion to business priorities. And this, for me, was extremely important in terms of getting our senior leaders to wake up and listen. Lots of great work was going on. But when we started to align what we were doing in terms of our inclusion strategy with what the business strategy was, this is where, we started to see the real impact, the real difference was taking place. It didn't just sit with the D&I committee or the ERGs or the staff network. It became something that everybody could get behind. People wanted to get behind it. And I think people don't necessarily always understand that inclusion can influence and have a positive impact on the business strategy. And I think this is something that, everyone needs to really consider. And so how do you frame that? How do you educate people so they understand how the two are connected? And in every business, it will be different because you need to tailor it to your individual business. But some things to think about might be, I mentioned the meetings and how you can have more inclusive meetings. Now, why would that be important? Well, if everybody has a voice in that meeting, it means that you can make better decisions. It means that there can be more innovation coming to the fore. And any business wants to be innovative and it wants to be making the best decisions within their meeting. So that is the way that you would say, by having a really inclusive way of running this meeting so that everyone feels safe to share their views, so that you share the agenda beforehand, so that you create spots and you call out people to be able to speak safely. This is how you're going to get that innovation coming to the fore. And then when it happens, you can showcase it and say, since we've introduced this new way of running our meetings, we found that more people are talking and many more great ideas are coming to the fore. You're demonstrating how that inclusive practice is delivering good outcomes for the business. Maybe it might be around, looking at your recruitment practices. Maybe it's around the language that's used within the ads. Maybe it's where you're placing the ads. Maybe it's to do with the stories and case studies that you have on the website that are linked to recruitment and showcasing who works for the business. Maybe it's around working with different recruiters that specialize in more diverse audiences. Now, again, why would the business want to do this? Why should we bother to change it? We've been recruiting in this way for so long. Well, the reason why is because we're going to attract more talent. We're going to have a wider pool of candidates applying for this role. And that's really important because it means that we can deliver better service for our customers because we're going to understand their needs better. If you work in financial services, this is really relevant with regards to consumer duty. We need to be able to, understand the needs of our customers. So again, you're talking about inclusive practice, but you brought it right back to how it's going to benefit the business. And I would suggest that when you put forward proposals around inclusion, if you want to make changes, that you always try to align them together. Maybe it's around the practices within the organization. We want to create a more inclusive culture. We want people to feel that they belong here. We want to do storytelling. We want the leaders to share their stories of how they got into their position so people understand social mobility and how you can break that down so everyone has a chance to reach the most senior positions, not just those who went to university. And again, the leaders might be like, why are we going to tell our stories? Why should I share how I got to this position? Well, it's going to help us to increase retention and engagement. When people hear your story, when they see you being vulnerable, they feel safer to be vulnerable too. And this will mean that colleagues will be more engaged. They'll be more able to perform. They'll increase their productivity. It means that they'll stay in the business for longer. So again, you're always putting the business case behind this initiatives that you're doing, okay? And this is a great way to get the people who are very much focused on business deliverables rather than inclusion to want to support and back you. This is how you get them to want to be part of it. You're influencing them by talking in their language, okay? And so this is another great way that I would highly recommend that you use to be able to influence and embed your inclusive practices into your organization and to not just be doing activities that are not actually making a change on the culture. This, number 2, is extremely important and will help you to do so. So yeah, if anyone wants to share any other things that they've done, someone just mentioned adopting anonymized recruitment. Exactly, that's another way in which you can attract a wider pool of candidates into your organization. Okay, so moving on to number 3. And this one, I guess, is one that I think I really excelled at. And what I mean by that is building allies and sponsors. Now, this is so important for you as an individual, not just in terms of trying to do things on your own, but who are the key influencers in your organization? Who are the people that, if they're aligned with your activity, if they talk well about what you're doing, will encourage others to do so? And you could just pause for a minute and really think about that. We call it a map. Let me go back, sorry. A mapping influence. Who are the people in your business that you think influence the decisions? Okay. And it could be, the senior leaders. It could be like I had someone in my business who was a long tenure colleague. So they've been with the business for like 20 years. And so they're very much respected. So getting that person to take part in activities or to really advocate for our inclusion work, made a big difference, because if that was a really respected voice in the business, maybe it's a respected expert. So maybe someone who is a specialist in your business, someone who maybe is, works in product development. They are revered almost because they bring new products to the business. Maybe it's a technical expert with regards to risk and compliance. Once they're on board, it means that, you've considered that within your inclusion work too. So I'd like you all to really think about and jot down the people in your business that you think influence the decisions. Because for me, what worked is that I built a very good relationship with our CEO. Now, he was, individually very passionate about inclusion too. He grew up in South Africa, and so he'd seen apartheid, and this really gave him a really good understanding of equity and diversity. And I felt that he was a really big supporter of the work, but also of me individually. Now, that relationship developed because he was obviously interested, but I also brought things to him. It wasn't just a one-sided relationship. I would share interesting things about inclusion with him. We got to have quarterly, bi-monthly meetings. And not everybody in the business would have a bi-monthly meeting with the CEO, especially because I wasn't in the top tier. I wasn't an exco at that point. I was a senior leader, but I wasn't at the top tier for the people who would generally be having meetings with him. And now when other people saw that, Atlyn and Lawrence are having meetings regularly, it gave me more power. It gave me more influence. It gave me the credibility because, Atlyn and Lawrence, the CEO, you can see that they're aligned. He would often talk about our inclusion activities in the town halls. And again, that made others want to be part of this. Oh, the CEO is really praising the last inclusion activity that we did, whether that was a panel discussion or, a drop-in, or one of the other initiatives. We tried to be very creative about it. And he'd always, talk very positively about what we were doing. And this meant that other senior leaders, he'd encourage others in his exco to take part. So then I had other influence that I'd get to share their lived experiences or to feature in a panel discussion. And more of them then would, tell their stories around how they got to be where they are, which helped to bring that sense of safety, psychological safety into the organization. But it could be that you have team leaders also. It doesn't have to be the CEO. The other thing that I did, which worked particularly well, was that I built up my credibility outside of our organization. So within your sector, whatever it may be, if you can, take part in initiatives with maybe your trade body or your professional association, or maybe with a trade publication, this then gives you credibility that others outside of your business are also respecting you and see you as a thought leader, which means that when you come back into the business, people are much more inclined to, listen and want to take on board your ideas and embed what you're sharing into the business. So if anyone's got any other ideas around the key people in their business that are influencers and that can help them, do share it. I'd love for you to do that. And so the reason why this is important, though, is because my CEO and other senior leaders like him and those who influence the decisions, they can increase your visibility. That's what happened. As I said, he mentioned our work, not just me, it was the whole D&I committee and the inclusive practices and the initiative that we were doing. He'd mentioned them and championed them. at town halls, which means that other people are, oh, I really want to be part of that. I want to be getting, the praise for being part of this activity. So the visibility is really key. They can unlock resources. I was able to, in those bi-monthly meetings with him, talk about budgets and spend. And we really want to get this speaker in, but they're going to cost this much. Is there budget for that? And he would be very supportive and unlock, budget for us. Now, if you're an inclusion champion in your business and you haven't got budget, it's very difficult to create a big impact. It can be done, but it's obviously much harder. So unlocking those resources is really key. Barriers. There's always going to be barriers when it comes to inclusion work. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But your senior leader can unlock barriers. And so, for example, for me, I wasn't in HR. I was as a marketing and insights when I initially started this. And initially, the HR team weren't always as receptive to some of the ideas that we had. In fact, they would be a blocker sometimes. But I would sometimes have a word with, whether it was my CEO or others who were in Exco, and they would sometimes be able to break down that barrier or have a word separately with the HR person, and they would soften up a little bit and maybe be more open to some of the things we talk about with regards to policies and practices and that we thought were important. So unlocking those barriers are really important. And then the last one, reinforcing accountability. My chat with the CEO also enabled us to add inclusive metrics into our one-to-ones, which meant that everybody in the business had to be accountable for inclusion work. It was part of everyone's monthly one-to-one. What inclusive practices have you delivered this month? What acts of allyship have you delivered? Which meant that it was at the forefront of everybody's mind, which meant that inclusion was embedded within all of our work, not just within the DI committee, but all aspects of the business. Now, I do think there was more work to be done in terms of how each manager did the one-to-ones. Some of them were great, some of them weren't so great, but just having it on there was a real sign that there was accountability and that inclusion was really important to the business. And all of that came about through the influence and the support that I had through our CEO and through our Exco. And so it's really important that the inclusion work, and for you to not just be thinking about inclusion from the bottom up, but from the top down. This is how you embed it. You create that influence and you stop sometimes having to bang your head against the brick wall, which can be very frustrating. And so executive sponsors really help inclusion work to gain credibility and traction across the organization. I can guarantee you, if you have your CEO or other senior leaders talking about it, others will want to get on board. So this is number 3 and one of the really important ones to consider. All right, so there's the 3 tips in terms of 3 practical ways to build influence without authority. And that's key. I didn't have the authority, but through all of those ways, and it's not just one, you really need to have all 3 of these things going on. But again, if you have any other tips that you want to share, do please put them in the chat or any questions about those things that I've shared. So I mentioned barriers, and I'm sure you know that it can feel like you are climbing a mountain sometimes, or I said hitting your head against the brick wall. And I feel like for me, sometimes I felt like it was quite personal. When this is really important to you, when for me, it was part of my values. As a person, fairness is really part of who I am. And I only identified that later on in my inclusion journey. But even growing up, when I'd see people being bullied, I would often have to call it out and say, stop doing that. And so because it's part of my values in terms of inclusion and fairness, when I get pushback or there's resistance, it can feel like a personal hit, okay? And we cover this in the e-learning program, how you can overcome that feeling like it's a personal hit against you. But this is also something that I think can be very helpful in terms of understanding that resistance, because it may not be personal at all. And quite often it isn't against you personally. The people that are maybe creating barriers or resistance may have different reasons, and they may be the harder ones to influence. But maybe for them, there are reasons why they're doing that. And for you, again, to influence them and to break through that barrier is to really understand what it is that is stopping them. So this is a framework called SCARF, which I found really helpful in terms of getting into the mindsets and really understanding the people, walking in their shoes and really understanding why they've got those barriers up, rather than going in with conflict and feeling like you need to, fight that person. That often doesn't work. And so perhaps maybe they've got a fear of getting it wrong. I'm sure you know that when it comes to inclusion work, people often feel they don't want to say the wrong word, they don't want to be embarrassed. And if it's a senior leader who's always, get things right, wants to, keep their personal brand intact, being asked to do something around inclusion that they're not really clued up on could bring about some fears. Maybe they haven't got the right vocabulary. They don't want to say the wrong word to describe a type of people, and then they get some blowback from that. So there could be quite a lot of fear, and that's something to acknowledge and support, because you can guide people and break down that fear and help them. And I think having one-to-one conversations, it could even be that water cooler conversation to really understand that person, as opposed to going at it always and making requests. Really understanding a bit about them personally can also help. And I mentioned the timing before too, because I do feel that there are cycles in people's lives when inclusion becomes more important to them. And it's normally when it hits them personally. And it could be them, or it could be someone close to them, where they see that, oh, this inclusion thing, I get it now, because someone has been impacted by maybe bias, discrimination, or some other life event that's impacted them. So this could also be a way to really understand the individual. But as I said, the fear of getting it wrong, that reputational risk, maybe that we want to do some content, an article that may go externally, and maybe they're worried about putting their name or face to that. With all this geopolitics going on right now, inclusion work can bring up, concerns for people. Talking about religion can sometimes be a bit uncomfortable for people. And so this could be for them around reputational risk. It could be around competing priorities. And we found this a lot, when we had really hard targets, when the sales team were focused on hitting a target, inclusion work became a very low priority for them. And it wasn't personal, but they were just like, we haven't got time to take part in this initiative right now. Our targets have been increased. We need to be on the phones. We need to be out there. We need to be focusing on our work. And it wasn't just with sales, other teams also. We found that as the business got busier, the focus on inclusion declined. But this is why it's also important to have it built into your policies and practices. By having it in the one-to-one meant that no matter how busy anybody was, I'm hoping they were still doing their monthly one-to-ones, and inclusion would still come up within that conversation. So competing priorities, I think, is quite a common one, and it's not personal, just people just haven't got the time, and then the inclusion work for them isn't top of their priority list like it might be for us and for the other inclusion champions. Discomfort discussing sensitive issues. And so we just had International Women's Day, and the Communicate Inclusively team, we did an article around women's health and touched on things like endometriosis, menopause. And for some people, this may be very uncomfortable for them to talk about. And so if there is a theme around health, again, for some people, this may not be their thing, that, I don't really feel comfortable talking about that. And that could be why they put a barrier up, or there's resistance to them taking part. And then the last thing could be around uncertainty about expectations. So quite often when we're doing initiatives, I would approach people. What I would tend to do is that I would maybe have an inkling and understanding of something about them. So I'm not just picking random people. There'd normally be a reason why I would approach you and see if you'd be interested in taking part in something. But people often say, like, oh, what will it entail? Where will this information be placed? How will it be used? And so, that uncertainty can also make people put barriers up. And so if you're making a request, if you're inviting people to take part, that transparency is really important, that you're sharing as much information as possible around what this initiative or this practice is going to entail, so that they can feel like they know they've got all the information that they need. But also to be open to questions. And also I'd say that if you change your mind at any time, you can back out. I'm not putting you into a corner. I'm not forcing you to do this activity. We really think that your thoughts and your experiences will add a lot of value. But if at any time you change your mind, just let me know. And, you don't have to follow through with that. So these are some of the ways I think that you can understand maybe the resistance, the pushback that some people may have, and can try to navigate that and see if you can still influence what's going on. So what might feel risky for this person about engaging with the inclusion work? That is the question you need to be asking. What is the real reason underneath this? And as I said, sometimes having those formal conversations can be a great way to understand and uncover where that uncertainty, that risk, that pushback may be coming from. And not to say that you will definitely find people who just do not believe in this work. And that's fine too. We're not here to force people who are very much against or anti-inclusion work. In fact, we want to keep them on side, because those people can be, I'm going to say dangerous, but they can be very disruptive if you go head to head with them. I think what I've found is when people are very anti-inclusion, and obviously we're seeing that more so now with, right-wing politics and the kind of misogynistic kind of communities coming to the fore. What I found best for me in my approach is to show them respect, to let them air their view, so they feel that they've got a platform. Because quite often, if you don't, and you try to push them down or diminish them, they can come back and be very disruptive. And it's not always what we want to do. We can agree to have different viewpoints, but I guess it's just a warning that let's say keep your enemies close, right? And that's, I guess, how my always approach was for people who were very anti-DNI, and there are many of them out there. And again, if you've got any experience in terms of people who are anti-DNI and how you've managed that as an inclusion champion, do please share. That would be great to hear what you've done to deal with that. But I guess also the thing is just to expect resistance and pushback and be prepared for it, because certainly it will happen. Okay, so we're going to do a bit of a role play now, and I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, although if you do want to come on camera or put something in the chat, I'd love that. I just want you to think about this, okay? So you are an ERG lead, okay? Let's just imagine that you're focused on religion, or it could be another area. But let's say for this example that you're an ERG lead and you're focused on religion. And then your group identifies a pattern where employees from certain religious backgrounds are less likely to be promoted. So maybe you conducted a sentiment survey, maybe there was some other demographic data that was gathered, and you've done some analysis. You're the ERG, you're the staff network. So this area is really important to you. So obviously you're going to really drill down and focus on this data where others may not have done so. So you identify this trend and you bring it to a senior leader and you tell them that, we can see that, certain people with this demographic background, we can see they're not promoted as much. And in fact, we've heard some stories from people also who have said that to us. But they respond and they say, we don't think we have a problem. Basically there's resistance. They're not interested. Okay, we don't think this is a problem. Leave it alone. They haven't said that, but that's quite often the energy you get. Like, you kind of get the little look like, Atlyn, don't go there. So this is what's happened to you. You've shared the insight. You've got a bit of data, but they say we don't think we've got a problem in the organization. What do you do next? And you can put it in the chat, or if anyone wants to share, I'd love that. But A, do you push harder using more data? B, do you find an ally in HR or leadership with this and go to them? C, do you gather employee stories to complement the data? And D, do you pilot a mentoring initiative or another initiative that could maybe help you to combat this issue? I'd love for everyone to share their thoughts. Yes, Sandra, you've got your hand up. Please feel free to come off mute and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you do in this scenario.
So my thought here in this scenario, if I can lower my hand, you've got the data. I would, if you've got that friendship, allyship with the CEO or senior leaders, get one of them or the sponsor to then approach HR on your behalf. Mm-hmm. Let them be the voice in the room. Because if you go as that individual, they're going to go, who does she think she is?
Yes, the credibility may not be there. I think that's a great answer, Sandra. Thank you for sharing that. I do think getting other people to help you to bring that the metrics and the data to those people really helps. And I found that too. That we've got some information here. but I'll give it to another exco member. They can go to their exco meeting and they can table it to each other, right? They're much more likely to listen and be open to hearing it from that person. So yeah, I think that's a great solution. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Charlotte says B, C, and D. So that's find an ally, C, to gather employee stories, and D, to pilot an initiative. Yes, it sounds like you've got a campaign there, Charlotte, and I love the idea of that. And SB says, also following your recommendation, I thought option B would be a good solution, to find an ally. Yes, thank you so much. So I don't know if anyone else wants to share their thoughts before I give my answer to what I'd do in this scenario. So before I do, anyone else want to pop any solutions, any options into the chat, or come onto the mic and share their thoughts? Okay. So yeah, I believe that, oh, thank you. Yep, C and D. C and B. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, definitely. I'm liking what a few of you have said, because it's a combination. No one of these solutions is going to be enough, I think, to make a difference. And to be honest with you, we couldn't guarantee that all of them will make a difference. However, if I had to approach this, I would certainly find an ally in HR leadership to help me with this, and maybe have a chat with them about the scenario that we approached whoever, and they said they haven't got a problem. What do you think we could do with this? Certainly would gather maybe some employee stories to share to complement the data, because numbers alone may not be enough to convince people. When you hear someone's story, when they tell you that, you know, I've applied for a promotion 5 times and I've been unsuccessful. Each time I've gone on to do additional learning and development. I've gone off and I've done a degree or whatever it may be. They've gone, you know, way beyond what would be required, and still they haven't. That is a very compelling story alongside the data. And I think, yeah, having some kind of solution or idea would definitely help. I'm not saying it has to be a mentoring initiative, but that you're presenting something, you're tabling some kind of solution, you're just giving them a problem to deal with. But perhaps we could do this initiative as part of our strategy. You're giving time for them to deal with it. Because I think when you present this kind of data, people get quite defensive about it. They see it sometimes as a personal attack. And especially if you're going to somebody maybe in HR who deals with the promotions, they may see it as a personal attack. So I think having that way that we can find a solution together can sometimes work, although sometimes it can be taken as overstepping and like, you know, this is not an area for you, this is for HR to deal with. But I do think, yeah, coming at it, a multi-pronged approach is definitely the way to go. So thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts, and for everyone who said more than one option. You're definitely on the right path. This is how you're going to influence this decision and be able to have an impact in your organization. So I'm just going to wrap up all the things that I shared there with regards to the key takeaways in terms of how can you influence your organization, how can you stop banging your head against the brick wall and be able to implement some of the initiatives, some of the practices that can actually change the culture within your organization. And I guess the first thing to say is that there's not one magic trick. It's going to be consistent activity, consistency in terms of the work that you're doing in order to make an impact. So I'm not giving you a magic wand here, but just some key things that can bring real change and when it comes to inclusion work and to keep it moving. So activity is great and we need activity, but what we need to really move from is really around influence. Okay, so if you've got activity and influence, this is the way to go. Just focusing on activity alone, you're going to burn out. You need that influence in order to embed your inclusive practices within your organization. We spoke about passion. For many of us, it's really something that we care about deeply. It's our mission. As I said, it's part of my values. It's something that I live and breathe by. But it's not just about passion. You need the credibility. You need to be endorsed. You need to show that you are serious. It's not just a passion project. It's not just a hobby. It's something, you know, that you're very serious about and you're taking a very strategic approach. And for me, we were the only group within all the different committees and staff notes that had a strategy document every year. Even before we were asked to, we had a strategy document. And it would highlight the areas we want to focus on. And it would showcase why we chose those areas based on data quite often, or based on information from colleagues across the business. This built our credibility. No one would say like, oh, what are you doing? Why are you doing this inclusion work? Oh, here's our strategy for the year. That's why we're doing this. This gives you credibility. You're not just doing it off the cuff because you think it's a fun thing to do or because it's International Women's Day. This is a strategic approach to our inclusion work, and this gives you credibility and moves you from being someone who's passionate about it to someone who's deadly serious and has got the credibility. The other thing that is really important is individual effort is great. It's not going to move you forward. You need to have shared ownership. You need to have those stakeholders on board, which is why the influence is so important. The more people you've got working on this, the more advocates you have, the more impact you can have in the organization. So part of your role as an inclusion champion is to bring your people, get people to come alongside you and to work with you, share the ownership. You could even give people responsibilities. Okay, you can do that if that's your role, or people can volunteer to do things that they really care about, because doing it alone you're not going to move the dial at all. You need to have as many people as possible and stakeholders at every level that are involved and actively doing things. Okay. And then 3 reminders, I guess, in terms of things to consider. Your influence is relational, it's not positional. It does not matter where you are in the organization. If you do not have those relationships, it is not going to work for you. Okay, so just remember that influence is relational, not positional. Those small everyday actions build credibility. You cannot put your inclusion hat on today and then take it off tomorrow. It needs to be consistent, because if you do something that maybe does not sit within your principles that you've spoken about, people will see that and be like, oh, look at that. I thought she's meant to be the inclusion champion. All of us make mistakes, don't get me wrong. But what I mean is that the consistency of your work brings the credibility. Okay, you can't, again, forget about this mission for a few months and then come back to it. If you really want to be a change maker in your business, you need to have that consistency so people know that is what you stand for, that is what you're about, and what you do. Inclusion is always going to be at the heart of it. Change accelerates with leaders and allies share responsibilities. So we spoke about having people around you. You need to really think about who are the people that influence the decisions in your organization. They must be part of your team. They need to be with you and aligned. And I'm not saying you're going to have all of them, but you need to have a few senior stakeholders who are allies and who are supporting you. And you can get allies in different ways. Like I said, for some, it may just be a word in your ear. They can guide you, give you suggestions and help you with that. Maybe others will table your ideas at these exco and board meetings. Maybe others will actually take part and will be on a panel, but not everyone's going to want to do all of those different things, which is why it's good to have different stakeholders that could potentially do different things. And so I have mentioned the Inclusive Impact Lab a few times. I just want to tell you a little bit about that before we end the session today. Again, if you have any questions before we get to the end, do please put them in the chat, or you're welcome to come off mute and to share your question. But you can use the barcode on screen to take a look and to register for the Inclusive Impact Lab, which will be launching next week. I'm really excited. We put so much time and effort into building this program, not just myself, but other inclusion champions have taken part and shared their insight, knowledge, and expertise to create this program. It's got a lot of really engaging and informative information, and it's very practical, because I find a lot of the training that I've done over time has been very theoretical, I guess. And I use the SCARF framework, which helps. And again, for your credibility, sometimes using frameworks, I would often table the Deloitte maturity model, the maturity matrix, to showcase where we were on our journey. And people are like, oh, the Deloitte, oh, that sounds good, So you can use, obviously, your strategy and reference frameworks that people, want to get behind alongside the practical side of things. So I'm not saying that theory isn't great, it really is, but in terms of learning and really understanding, how can I take something away from this e-learning program and implement it into my organization? That's what we're really thinking about, based on our own experiences in terms of being change makers in our organizations. The other great thing about this, I'm a bit biased, but the other great thing about the Inclusive Impact Lab is that we've designed it based on different personas, because not every inclusion champion is going to be in the same place, right? And so, as I said, you can see on here, we've got the change champion, and you may be a senior leader already, and that you do have influence, and you can, influence the leadership within the organization and put things forward, but maybe you're just not sure how to do that. Maybe you're a bridge builder, which is a middle manager. You're trying to influence both up and down, which can be very difficult. maybe you're the everyday influencer, and this could be someone who is in a staff network who's really keen to be an ally within your team in your daily actions. Or maybe you're an advocate. Maybe you do work in HR. Maybe you are a D&I chair. And so you're trying to drive systemic changes, but you're looking for some practical tips in terms of how you can do that. And again, maybe you're the conscious colleague that you're in a business, you can see that change needs to happen, but you're just not sure where to start. And so we've done each of the modules, and it covers a range of different topics and as I said, things that you can embed, but it also talks to you individually based on where you are. And so what can I do within my role? Now, if you're a senior leader, it's very different to someone who's just a regular colleague within your business. And so it kind of talks about what you can do within your role. If you're working in HR, again, it's very different to someone who's not in the HR team in terms of what they can do. And so again, take a look at the QR code. You can join the waitlist for when it launches next week. But really, it covers everything that you need to really consider as an inclusion champion. And if you sign up before the 31st of March, you'll get 15% off the registration fee. So if you have any questions about the program, you're not sure, anything you want to know about what's covered, please do message me. I'm more than happy to talk you through it and to showcase all that's there. There's also lots of videos. There's a workbook. And the workbook, again, is something that we know is really important, because as you fill it in, it can build up and actually be the base for your strategy document going forward. And so as you're going through each of the modules, there are 12 modules, and the last module is kind of bringing it all together, so that at the end of it, you've got a great document that you can share with your organization or use as your own playbook to implement inclusion within your organization. So do please take a look at that. So, okay, we've got another 3 minutes left to go. The hour has just absolutely flown by. But does anybody have any questions at all? Or anything they want to share, any thoughts? Because I think in addition to having allies in your organization, the other thing about the Inclusive Impact Lab, which I know is so important, is having allies outside of it. Sometimes I just really was quite frustrated and wanted someone outside of my business to talk to about it. I'm sure my family probably didn't want to hear about me talking about inclusion every day, but sometimes it's just great to have people who get it, who understand this mission and understand why we're so passionate about this work, and that you can speak to. And also, I think best practice, it's all about creative ideas. And so having, again, a community of other champions who can say, oh, I did this to implement that, or we've got a employee resource group for the LGBTQ+ community, or we've got a race staff network. This is how we set it up. Or we did a focus group to gather more insights before deciding what we wanted to do. These are some of the questions that we asked. These are very practical things that can be really great. And so as part of being in the Inclusive Impact Lab, you'll be part of our community. But you can also at any time email me. I'll be more than happy to help. Okay, so we've got a question from Amy. What do you think are the best ways to measure success and impact? Oh my goodness. The biggest section in the program is data. In fact, we had to split it into 3 parts because there's just so much in there. So I don't think there's one thing with regards to measuring success or impact. I think it covers so many different areas. But I guess for me, the first thing is to benchmark where you are. So it's always good, I guess, at any point in time, let's just do a survey, or let's speak to our people and understand what their current experience is. Because if you don't do that at the beginning, how can you track any success after that, right? So it's really important that you get a pulse at the very beginning. And you can also do pulses throughout. I think Amy is a really great way to do that. The other thing I would suggest is that after you do something, an initiative, whether it's an inclusive language guide, which we implemented, but it wasn't just a guide on its own, we had sessions around it, is to get feedback. People will give feedback when they feel most comfortable. And so at any time we did an activity, we'd get feedback on that particular initiative, but also what else would you like us to do? So always leave the door open for people to be able to share how they felt that initiative went, and you can use that to help you to improve for the next time, but also what else would you like to see us doing? I also think that for you at the beginning, once you've done that kind of pulse, is to understand, what does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? And it may just be engagement as a starting point. In fact, we just want to get 50% of colleagues to attend one of our initiatives throughout the year. Or it could be that, we want to see more diversity within our leadership team. And this can be quite difficult, but, we often know that a lot of leadership teams are not as diverse as they could be. And that could be to do with gender, race, or sexual orientation, whatever it may be, disability, etc. And so, again, you'll have an idea of who's there currently and how we're going to move the dial. Would like to see, for genders, the easy one, 50-50 representation. That's what success is going to look like for us. And that's what we're working towards. For me personally, I feel the biggest metric that I feel, makes me feel good is around the sentiment. How are people feeling in this organization? Do they feel that sense of belonging and safety? And again, this is where the pulse can come in. And when you ask the questions around, are you able to speak to your manager? How would you rate that experience? How do you feel about your chances of being promoted in the organization? Is that low or high? How do you feel the business generally cares about you? These kind of sentiment questions, again, are a really good pulse at the beginning, and it may be high, which is great, but maybe you can see if you also have demographic data, which is what we found, that certain groups would score very high and others would score very low on those questions. And so for us, the metric was around, we would want everybody to score that, not just certain groups. And so we identified through that, we're going to be focusing on colleagues with disability, because we saw people with disability scored lowest. And so our metric was around, how do we increase awareness around disabilities? How can we get people to understand the needs around neurodiversity? So then we got a staff network on neurodiversity. They had a space to support each other, but also doing toolkits for managers. That was the thing that came out, that they felt that they couldn't really share their needs with their managers. And when they made a request for reasonable adjustments, they weren't being received very positively. And so for us, we identified that as a core area to focus on. And so again, it could be very personal, Amy, in terms of what success looks like. But I do think gathering that data really means that you can be laser sharp on what areas you want to focus on, because you cannot do it all. Okay, but when you decide what areas you want to focus on, what does success look like in that particular area as well? I've rambled, but there's a lot to cover with data, which is why we've got 3 parts in the e-learning program. But again, if you want to ask any additional questions about data, please feel free to message me. I'm more than happy to talk through that. Okay, we are 3 minutes over. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm really happy that you joined, Amy, and it'll be good to catch up soon as well. But thank you, everybody, for joining today. It's great to see that there are so many inclusion champions, that really want to find ways to continue to make an impact on their organization, because this is something that I care about deeply. And without you, there'd be so many organizations that are standing still when it comes to inclusion. We need advocates like you, but we also need support. We need guidance. And sometimes your business may not always see the need for you to do that. So you need to advocate for yourself. And I'd love for you to join the program or to reach out to me at any time if you need support. But thanks again for joining. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you in the program soon. But take care. I'll send the recording around anyway, and some other information about the course. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. See you now.